Good morning. Let me start in the usual but not to be forgotten way. Let me thank Donna Rosen. Ben, I know, will be joining us later. And as important as Donna and Ben are, I think let's take a moment to thank the staff of Kent Presents. That makes this look effortless.
Yeah, I will tell you, get a few pictures.
Oh, that wasn't me. I have one other thank you. You know you married the right woman if your wife thinks that this is an appropriate way to spend your anniversary. So let me thank my wife for letting us do this. She's a strange one, but there you have it. She married me. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm honored to serve as the moderator. I only get to be the moderator here because one of the great honors of my career is that I sit on the executive board of the Innocence Project. Just a few notes about the IP. The Innocence Project is just past its 25th birthday, its 25th anniversary. It was started at Cardozo Law School, where I teach, by Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck. And the goal of the Innocence Project was to use DNA evidence to exonerate wrongfully convicted people. Though our mission has expanded, the core goal remains using evidence in cases where it is decisive to release those who have otherwise been imprisoned, even though they were actually innocent. From there, we've expanded to a staff and crew of just over 70 people in the Innocence Project in New York, which is, so to speak, the headquarters, and hundreds more in the Innocence Project network, which spans the country, and indeed now starting to span the world. There are Innocence Projects overseas as well. To date, the IP has exonerated, or DNA evidence connected to the IP has exonerated nearly 400 innocent people through DNA alone, with thousands more being exonerated through connected projects with the Innocence Project. Many people who've been exonerated were people who were exonerated from death row. So I say with no exaggeration that the Innocence Project literally grabs people from death's jaws and saves lives. And so it's a great, I tell you, the emails we get on Exoneration Day are like nothing else. They are just like nothing else. I think despite the amazing moments those are, I should also note that the Innocence Project changes more than the individuals in front of us. Because of the work of the Innocence Project and now our expanded brief in reforming the kinds of laws that lead to accidental or mistaken or even malicious prosecutions, our broader reform project has meant, thank God, that there is every day a little less work for us to do in the future. The Innocence Project has spearheaded things like recording confessions to make sure that a jury knows that the last confession with certainty was not actually what happened. We've changed prosecutorial misconduct laws and on and on and on. So that's just to say that the effect of the Innocence Project radiates out far beyond the unbelievably important job of saving lives. Just when the Innocence Project was starting 25 years ago, Justice Scalia was penning in a case that it was impossible to imagine anybody wrongfully convicted on death row. And 25 years later, we know that that is not just impossible, but all too common. And it's the IP's work that has made that painfully clear. From almost the beginning of the work of the Innocence Project, Nina Morrison has been one of our leaders and one of the extraordinary people. Being on the board is quite silly. It means that I get to take credit when Nina saves somebody's life. And so my job as a moderator is really just to turn it over to our incredible Nina Morrison and let her tell you more about the IP.
Ben and Donna, who, in addition to being the amazing organizers of this event, are generous supporters of our project and really help make our work possible. So like a lot of lawyers, I had a number of people tell me not to go to law school and definitely don't practice criminal law. You're going to hate it and be miserable and it's so depressing. You'll be banging your head against the wall all the time and you're an optimist, don't want to kill your spirit. I ignored all that advice. I became a criminal lawyer after some fits and starts in other areas. And I'm proud to say that while I do have a lot of days when I am banging my head and just about every other part of my body against the proverbial wall, I'm really lucky. I've landed and stayed for 16 years prisoners in one of the most wonderful places to work I can imagine. And even though criminal courthouses are really depressing and scary and sad places, not much good happens there. Even if someone is convicted who should be convicted, the crime doesn't get undone. Someone's going to prison, which is a horrible place, usually for a long time. I've been there for moments of real joy when somebody who I've been representing for many years gets to walk free into the arms of their family, sometimes for the first time in decades. And sometimes, if we're lucky, the judge or the prosecutor will apologize to the wrongly convicted person on behalf of the community and really do what they can to make it right. One of the cases that I worked on most recently, is that just a trigger finger? I clicked it too fast. That was sort of the best of what we have seen in this work, was the exoneration of a man named Mark Denny, who went to prison for 30 years for a crime he didn't commit, starting at the age of 17. He was a junior in high school. He just got out of prison this past December, and I had his case for 8 years. So he was just turned 47 a couple weeks after he got out of prison. And when you think about the life that you spent between the ages of 17 and 47, it's really breathtaking. Mark's case was in some ways sadly typical in that it was just a police investigation gone wrong. There wasn't actually any intentional misconduct. They used a really bad lineup procedure that did everything you're not supposed to do. They showed the victim his photograph and then put him in a lineup, one after the other, even though she didn't pick out his picture and they didn't really know what they were doing. So there wasn't really any nefarious conduct, but there was a real failure in the system, and he lost 30 years of his life. The good news is that after we got the case and a new district attorney was elected in Brooklyn a few years ago, they started a unit designed to go back and look at those old cases and actually work with us to try to correct some of these injustices. And we did a 2-year cooperative reinvestigation with some of the best prosecutors I've ever worked with. And ultimately, even without DNA evidence, which we could never find, it got lost in the system, they agreed that he was innocent and set him free. So it was really one of my proudest moments as a lawyer. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. This is one of those cases, and what I'm going to talk about today are some of the cases where the system has really failed, and failed in a few ways. One is in allowing a minority, and I will say it really is a minority, but a small but significant number of people in law enforcement, and particularly prosecutors, to convict someone intentionally breaking the law in the process, getting away, in some cases literally with murder, and in some cases just with horrible injustice. And also, to compound the error, to continue to cover up hidden evidence of someone's innocence and then refuse to take any action to hold the people accountable for those misdeeds, even after the person has been found exonerated or otherwise released from prison or death row. John's case is very well known. He was not one of our clients, but he spent 14 years on death row in New Orleans, or in Angola prison, but out of New Orleans, for a murder he didn't commit, and he was also charged with a robbery, a related crime that made him eligible for the death penalty. He came within a week of being executed before it was discovered that several prosecutors had intentionally withheld a scientific report of a blood test that proved he didn't commit the robbery that made him death eligible, and also eyewitness evidence that went a long way towards clearing him of the murder. His death sentence was overturned. He was put on trial yet again, and the jury acquitted him. So the citizens of New Orleans knew what the right thing was to do. They also knew what the right thing was to do when he filed a civil rights lawsuit, and they found that his civil rights had been violated by the district attorney's office specifically, that had for years had what's called a pattern in practice of failing to train the lawyers in disclosing evidence of someone's innocence and in setting policies that were designed essentially to lead to this result, or indifferent to the likelihood that that result would come about. And the jury gave him $14 million for every year he spent on death row and in prison. The US Supreme Court took it away every dime. Said that to sue prosecutors are special creatures in our legal system, and they are effectively immune from suit. The only exception is if you can show a policy pattern or practice on the part of the DA's office, and even then, you can't just show a single act of misconduct, what they characterized in John's case as a single act. You have to show a pattern of similar acts. So because he didn't have other cases where other people had blood test reports withheld in similar circumstances, even though he'd gone to death row, he certainly was harmed by that single act, he didn't get a dime. It was a 5-4 decision. That shows you how important the court composition is. And after that, a lot of people said there's no chance you can ever recover against prosecutors, and we're never going to be able to hold them accountable. We think otherwise. I'm going to tell you a little about what we're doing, but it was really a tragedy and a sad day for our justice system. None of the prosecutors in John's case, except the whistleblower who came forward with the evidence that cleared him, have ever been subject to any discipline by the bar. To this day, only one prosecutor in the history of the great state of Louisiana has ever been disciplined for withholding exculpatory evidence in a criminal case, even though there have been dozens of cases where the courts have found that to have occurred. So the bar isn't doing its job. Certainly none of the prosecutors were themselves prosecuted for that action, which in my view was pretty criminal. We've had some better luck in some other places, starting to, I should say, holding prosecutors accountable. One case I'm not going to have a lot of time to get into, but my client, Michael Morton, wrote a beautiful memoir by Simon & Schuster that is available for sale here. Had a very unusual and unprecedented response to his wrongful conviction in that regard. Michael is pictured on the left with his mustache, in his early 30s with his beloved wife Christine and their young son Eric, and on the right, 25 years later when he was finally released from prison, holding a certificate of actual innocence. Michael's case is a tragedy on so many levels. Every wrongful conviction is a tragedy. None are worse or better than others. His is a tragedy because the murder victim in the case was his wife. She was killed by an intruder who came into their home when he was at work, and he went to prison allegedly for her murder and lost custody of their only son, who was raised by Christine's family and grew up hearing that his father had killed his mother when that wasn't the case. So he literally lost everything. His parents stood by him. He had a few friends who continued to stay in touch with him. And his trial lawyer, who knew Michael was innocent, there was almost no evidence that he did it, came to us and said, I think I've done all I could for this man, and can you please take the case? We spent 5 years in court trying to get DNA testing done to clear him over the prosecutor's objection, and finally got one of the appeals courts to let us do it. And by a true miracle, there was a bandana at the crime scene 100 feet away that the perpetrator had dropped, kind of in wicked Cinderella style, as he was fleeing the scene, that had traces of Christine's blood and the perpetrator's own skin cells on it. We ran it in the National DNA Database, and we got a match to a convicted felon. He had a drug conviction, nothing serious, other than a couple drug cases and a burglary. But we discovered that that man had been living a few blocks from the scene of another murder that took place 2 years after Michael went to prison. And we thought, that's too crazy, that can't be right. But then we also thought, that's too big a coincidence not to mean something. We got a prosecutor in another county who was much more sympathetic to justice to agree to do a DNA test in that case, and we proved that the man, Mark Norwood, who we got the match to in Christine Morton's killing, also committed the second crime, which had never been solved. Even worse, we discovered along the way, so Michael was set free, but in the course of our investigation, we discovered that there was powerful evidence of Michael's innocence. The young son, who was 4 at the time, had actually seen the whole crime and then stopped talking about it soon after, but told his maternal grandmother, who made a tape recording and told the police, that was never turned over. And he said his dad didn't do it and his dad wasn't home. And he described it in detail that this child could not have known if he hadn't witnessed it. So, here's what happened. The former prosecutor, Ken Anderson, pictured it right in the microphones, had become a judge. He went to jail. It's never happened before. Now, I say he went to jail. He went to jail for 5 days. It was symbolic. He pled guilty ultimately to 1 count of contempt of court, and he gave up his law license. We had to spend a year preparing a case against him, and in Texas there's a really interesting procedure that more states should copy, where citizens can bring criminal complaints against government officials, and if a judge agrees, the judge can order that person's arrest. You don't have to wait for the local prosecutor who may be in bed with the elected official to do it. So it was symbolic, but it led to a lot of changes. There was a law changing what are called the pretrial discovery laws, the laws that govern when prosecutors have to hand over evidence to you, making it something that the prosecutors essentially controlled into something much more open and automatic. And our Texas colleagues, one of whom, Patricia Cummings, is here today as my guest at the conference, and an old friend of mine, helped get this wholesale change in law passed, and the law was named after Michael Morton, and it was signed by Rick Perry, Republican governor, and overwhelmingly passed unanimously by the Republican-controlled legislature in Texas. So this is really not a Democratic issue, it's not a liberal issue. You know, the same, Michael is a crime victim. The person who killed his wife was out killing at least one other person that we know about at the time. So we have had some success at the Innocence Project redefining the way people see these issues as not just left-right, but have worked with a lot of people from across the aisle on some of these reforms. Michael's case has helped us, and some others bring new attention to an old problem. These are two of my clients on the left, Stan Mosey and Dennis Allen, and another client on the right, Joseph Buffy. Stan and Dennis had their murder convictions unanimously thrown out by the highest court, criminal court in Texas last year, on the grounds that the prosecutor had knowingly suppressed letters from jailhouse informants who had claimed to the jury that they didn't get a deal, but actually were sitting there demanding deals and asking for deals and talking about the deal they got, and then got on the stand and said they didn't even ask for anything, and he just let them testify to things that he knew were lies. But he saved the letters in the file because he thought there's no way the Innocence Project or anybody else is going to see these as my file, and we got it. And then Joseph Buffy, another story that could be its own presentation, was wrongly convicted of a rape after falsely confessing at the age of 19 at 4 a.m. in police custody after maintaining his innocence for hours and finally getting worn down. He ended up taking a plea on the advice of his woefully awful defense lawyer who had done 45 minutes worth of investigation into the case before telling him he was going to go to prison for life if he didn't take a deal. And it turned out that the state had DNA evidence that they had already tested showing that Joe was innocent. And they had it not at the time of the plea, but at the time Joe was sentenced 3 months later, and they never said a word about it. And so Joe did another 12 years in prison before we got his conviction overturned. But it was by the High Court in West Virginia, which, as you may know, has had some troubles lately, but at the time was a very respected court. And the whole court just got impeached for spending thousands of dollars in taxpayer funds on their couches, but they did a real work of justice in Joe's case. All right, this brings me to the man of the hour, Robert Jones. Robert was a client of our amazing colleagues at the New Orleans Innocence Project, which does incredible work, and they brought one of my colleagues and me onto the case for the ninth inning, as I like to call it, last year to help get him home. I'm going to let Robert tell you his story, but I'm going to give you some of the legal highlights. He was wrongly convicted of a series of crimes, a murder and a rape and a robbery that were all committed by the man on the left, Lester Jones. You can see that Lester bears an uncanny resemblance to the composite sketch prepared by the rape survivor in one of those cases. He was arrested originally based on a false tip that was called into the Crime Stoppers hotline about a shooting death in the French Quarter. And even after it was discovered quickly that that tip was false, they had already put Robert in a lineup and shown him to the rape victim, and she picked him out. They arrested Lester Jones driving a car matched by the victim of the rape, described by the victim of the rape, and by the eyewitness to the murder. He was found in the possession of jewelry from all of those crimes and several other related crimes. But they were stuck with this the lineup ID they'd already gotten of the rape victim. They'd essentially burned the witness because she'd picked out Robert, so they thought, well, we can't really put Lester on trial for that case. So they put Robert on trial for the rape and said that he must have committed the crime in cahoots with Lester Jones, that he had borrowed Lester's car in exchange for giving him the jewelry. It was a made-up theory. There was no evidence to support it. And in fact, the police officer who investigated it told the district attorney, we could not find any evidence connecting Robert Jones and Lester Jones. The police officer who investigated the murder told the district attorney's office, we arrested the wrong person. I have never in my career come forward and said, I arrested the wrong person, and I'm telling you that now. And they plowed ahead. Robert's defense lawyer did not know virtually any of this except that the rape victim's jewelry and the car had been found in Lester's possession. He didn't know that Lester was a suspect and had been charged in several other crimes in a 2-week spree. And he didn't know that Lester Jones, who had given a statement against Robert in the murder case, had taken it back and had told the DA he made it up. Robert gets convicted of the rape at trial based solely on the victim's ID and a very incomplete record, goes to prison, and fights his own case on his own from the inside for many years. And one of the things that he managed to do was get an investigator to go talk to Lester Jones. And Lester said to him what he said to the DA, I made the whole thing up. Robert wasn't there. I don't even know Robert. I never loaned him my car. I never loaned him any jewelry. And I certainly didn't do any murder with him. So Robert files this affidavit and a very well-written legal brief on his own to say, get me out of here, because I'm innocent. I took a plea to a murder because they withheld this evidence from me, and I thought I could have 2 life sentences instead of 1, and I would have a hard enough time fighting 1 life sentence. And the prosecutor said to his lawyers, Oh, this is just a sudden recantation by Lester Jones. Lester Jones' recantation came 15 years after the crime. He didn't know Robert Jones, he didn't lend him his car, he's just making it up now. Jones does not go so far as to suggest, nor can he plausibly, that such information was in the state's possession at the time of trial, and so you should dismiss this altogether. Well, it turns out that it was in the state's possession because there was a memo sitting in the file, which had been there for almost 25 years, from the prosecutor, Fred Menner, who is now a federal prosecutor still working in New Orleans, dated early April of '96, right when Robert took the plea, explaining to his bosses why he needed to reduce the charge from murder down to a lesser charge because they had no case. They didn't have a murder case. The only evidence against Robert, his memo said, is Lester's statement. And on May, he had the date wrong, it was in April, I met with Lester and he recanted the entire statement. And then the memo goes on to say that we have no case, it wouldn't even survive an appeal in the event of a conviction. The eyewitness who originally pointed to Robert, who actually didn't, is dead. We don't have a case. But with no case, let's go ahead and plead him guilty to something we can't prove. And so not only do we have the original misconduct, we then have 25 years later, the prosecutor's office coming in and telling Robert and telling the judge he doesn't have the goods when the goods were sitting in their own file all along. After this came to light, they still didn't drop it, and we had to go to a hearing for several days with myself and several other lawyers, taking up a week of the judge's time, arguing why all of these cases should finally be thrown out. The rape case had been thrown out already, the murder case not yet. And finally, just before the elected district attorney was subpoenaed to testify, they decided to drop the case, and Robert was exonerated. And he will tell you a little more about how he survived that ordeal, but to say that he is an extraordinary human being would be the understatement of the century. So we're not done yet. We got a little press coverage recently when we filed a civil rights lawsuit as the Innocence Project. We don't usually get involved in these cases, civil rights cases about money damages, but this case was so important that we decided that I could join the legal team from Covington and Burling and Jones Walker that are suing the district attorney and his office in New Orleans, because we think we finally have the case that the Supreme Court said in John Thompson's case, the death row case, that you need to finally hold a DA's office accountable. There is a pattern over many years. It's the same type of evidence, faulty eyewitness evidence, or evidence impeaching the reliability or undermining the reliability of an eyewitness or a victim that they've withheld in at least 40 other cases that we know about, all from New Orleans over the last few decades. And so if we don't have a pattern, nobody does. That's our theory, we're sticking to it. Like most litigation, it's gonna take a long time, but this time, Robert is a free man while that plays out, and it is my great joy to give him his own grand entrance, and now welcome you, Robert Jones.
Thank you. Where do I begin? Well, as you heard, so many details about the case. So now I'm going to skip the details and basically give you a brief synopsis of what I've been through. I was born and raised in New Orleans. I come from a single-parent household. I lost my father at the age of 5 years old. I made a few mistakes, just like the average kid in the neighborhood growing up poor. And eventually I dropped out of school in the 8th grade and sort of became like a product of my environment to an extent. And at the age of 19, I was arrested and falsely accused for crimes I did not commit. And at the age of 19, I stood before a court with an 8th grade education, and without a complete understanding as to what was happening in my life. I mean, I knew I was innocent, and I was like, okay, why me? Why? How could this happen to me? All right, because during that particular time, it wasn't a consensus where a lot of people were. It was made public known where a lot of people was being convicted for crimes they did not commit. So therefore, I mean, it wasn't a clue. I didn't have a clue what was about to happen to me, right? So in that particular instance, throughout the period of 4 years I stayed in the parish prison, I was tormented by the fact that I could be found guilty. I could be sent away for the rest of my life. But I still had a little smidgen of a hope in the criminal justice system, to the extent that I didn't understand that people get found guilty for crimes they didn't commit. So in 1996, ultimately I was found guilty, and I received a life sentence in 121 years. A life sentence in Louisiana is a life without parole, probation, or suspension of sentence. And I had 121 years to back that up. So essentially, Louisiana was saying that even if you die with a life sentence and come back to life, you still owe me 121 years. And which is ridiculous. So in 1996, that was a terrible phase of my life. And within the same year, 1996, was even a worse phase of my life. It's therapeutic for me to talk about it now. I couldn't talk about it alone a few years ago. In 1996, I lost my brother to street violence. And I was feeling responsible for his death primarily because of the fact that he was selling drugs to raise money to give me a turn, to get me out of prison. And he lost his life. He lost his life with that, and that devastated me. I wanted to kill myself, and I mean, I was totally devastated by that. But I decided to do something different. I remember this well. I was walking around the prison yard, so depressed, deprived of life. I was down, devastated. And the guy who I met when I first went to Angola prison, he walked up to me and said, "What's wrong, Robert? I see you're going through some things." And he was a boxer trainer. And I always tell this story. This guy told me, he said, "Man, you know what? I see you're down on life." He said, "Life is like boxing." He said that if you allow life to knock you out, just like you allow someone in the ring to keep on punching you and you fall down, life's gonna defeat you. He said, just like in boxing, you gotta throw a counter punch. You have to continue on the fight. And that's what I did. So in 1996, I enrolled in the literacy program inside the prison. And from there, I obtained my GED. And then I enrolled in several college courses, including the laws, political science, business, psychology, and a variety of other courses. I took those particular courses and re-educated myself to the extent because I didn't want to be that same 19-year-old kid that stood before the judicial system or any other system that had no understanding that. And as time proceeded on, I became what we classified as jailhouse lawyer, inmate counsel. I started.
He's good. I read a lot of what he wrote.
It's really
good.
I started fighting for other guys who was less legally inclined. Filed a lot of petitions in their name. I also won a few cases in the Louisiana Supreme Court and the Circuit Court. For other guys, of course. And I was filing my application, my pro se application, and seemed like I was getting no relief until the Innocence Project of New Orleans and the Innocence Project of New York, for the most part, or the Innocence Project, I'm gonna say that. They came on the board and they brought their resources, and everything I have been saying for many years have came to light. And right before I got out, you know, like I said, right before I got out, I realized that my mother was sick. And when I got out, that was one of my joys, because I always feared of dying in prison while my mother was alive. And I actually got out, and she was able to see me free. My mother just passed in April. I just buried my mother in April. And I'm okay, because she was able to see me free. She was able to see me free. She was able to see me exonerated of all these crimes that they charged me with. And as I said, so right now I'm currently employed in the public defender's office, New Orleans Public Defender's Office, helping other guys. I have a nonprofit organization called Freedom Foundation, and it's a nonprofit organization that's kind of like mentor the youth, and that's my life mission. I also have a book that I wrote with 2 other guys called Unbreakable Resolve. It's on Amazon.com.
We had a snafu in getting copies here, but we have flyers outside if any of you want Robert's book. It's
But my
on
life
Amazon.
mission is to help the youth, help guide the youth, so they wouldn't fall in the situation that I fell in, even though I didn't do anything. But society have its way of sucking these guys up and lead them down the wrong path. I mean, since I've been home, me and the other 2 co-founders of the organization, we have mentored over 200 youth. And my fiance, she'll tell you, she's a strong woman because she was 16 years old when I was arrested and falsely accused of the crimes, and she's still here. She's still holding strong. She practically raised our kids on her own. So I mean, the system set out. It's a system of what I call demonic people, in a sense, no matter what color you are, if you're a part of that system, because wrongful convictions, and I'm gonna make this point before I close, wrongful convictions don't just stem from 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Wrongful convictions started after the Reconstruction era of slavery. It came with the black codes, because when they instituted the black codes, they falsely accused and convicted a lot of those slaves just to get the free labor for those guys, because the 13th Amendment says the only way that you can force somebody to use their particular, that servitude, if you have a conviction, right? And after the black codes came the Jim Crow laws, in which we're living in the new Jim Crow laws now, and that paradigm shift of concept have proceeded the way in our criminal justice system. And majority of the criminal justice system is a pay-or-use system, in the sense that crime don't pay for criminals, but it pay for everybody else, and which is crazy. But yeah, and that's the heartbeat of wrongful convictions. And my life mission, as I said, is kind of like to guide the youth and to stand up for justice. And everybody who know me, I'm not afraid to speak to power, to speak to anyone that matter. I always tell the truth, in a sense, and I stand up for what is right. And so, you know, I'm honored to be here. I thank Don and Ben for inviting me here. I mean, to get on this stage and kind of like share my story. Not in the sense that I want your sympathy, but I want you to take my story and use it as a motivation, in the sense, I mean, just think about it. I come from poverty. I came from poverty. I was uneducated, in the sense of not understanding the world that controlled my life. And I mean, I lost a lot of debt in my family. I've seen a lot in my life, but I didn't allow those circumstances to make me out a monster, right? I didn't allow those things to make me out a monster. And I understand what those systems are designed to do for people. So therefore, it didn't make me out a monster, it didn't make my fiance out a monster, nor none of my kids and my closest friends. So I thank y'all for this opportunity, and I'm kind of like, I'm interested in seeing what questions you all.
I presume there's no more to be said, so we. But just in case there's some questions, I know that the reminder is to wait for the mic to get to you. Why don't we just start here? All the way in front, please.
Robert, I told you how sorry I am, but I'm thrilled at your attitude and what you're doing in the future. How did you keep from being bitter, from giving up, from feeling the anger that you are deserved to feel?
That's a question I get all the time. I put it like this. Well, I'll address the first part of your question first. For as anger and bitterness, I mean, I'm a human being. I get frustrated, I get angry, but I choose not to focus on anger and have bitterness in, because it oftentimes, I mean, most guys that's in prison, that's in my situation, that's what happened to them, and they don't grow, they don't progress in life. They can't think. They can't think further than their situation because of the fact that they have anger and bitterness in them. So I choose not to go that route. But I use my frustration and resentment towards the right and wrongs. You know what I mean? Not if it's just in my situation, but in the other situation. That's why I stand up for the most part for the things that's injustice. Anytime I see injustice anywhere, I mean, if you're doing something wrong, you're around me, I'm gonna tell you about it. Or I'm gonna put you in check. And everybody who know me, that's what I do. Even if you're my family member, my brother, anybody, I mean, my good friends, if I see you doing something wrong, you're not right, I'm gonna tell you about it. And the next thing is that I think there's two essential things in every human being that maybe fall in any type of situation. I mean, there's a flight mode and there's a fight mode, right? I mean, if you fall in the hole, you're not just gonna give up, you're gonna keep on trying to climb. So you got the same fight in you. You just know was put in that type of situation. You know what I mean? So it's either you have a flight or a fight. And I choose to fight all the time.
Let's go on this side.
Are there any ways or any initiatives in progress to change the structural incentives for prosecutors to drive towards convictions and pleas and treat that as the accomplishment rather than justice? Ways to actually change, I don't know, either the way we select prosecutors or the way prosecutors are rewarded.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is yes. We're having more progress in some parts of the world than others, but you know, it can happen in a few ways. I mean, there's the good news is that there have been a number of elected, in particular newly elected district attorneys who have come in on, you know, really riding a wave of public accountability and public concern for these issues on mass incarceration, on fairness, on wrongful convictions, and have said they want to do things differently. And many of them have recognized that part of it is changing the culture and in changing the incentives. So I have actually been invited to speak with several district attorneys' offices and their senior staffs to talk to them about what we've seen gone wrong in these cases and our thoughts on how to fix it. I mean, I've never been a prosecutor, so my expertise is a little bit limited, but I have the outsider's view. And some of it is really simple stuff like performance reviews. You know, don't just make it about never track conviction rates, don't see that as a measure of success, but make sure that at the end of the year and really during the year, you're recognizing people for things other than winning a big trial. So if somebody drops a case, there's one DA who wrote a young ADA, as assistant district attorney, had written a long memo explaining why he needed to dismiss a case, that he wasn't sure if the person did or didn't do it, but the evidence had really fallen apart and he couldn't even recommend a plea because they had no case. And he wrote this long memo, and the boss calls him in and says, and he's terrified, like the high-up elected DAs called him to his office, he's about to get fired, and he says, I just want you to know, your supervisor gave me this memo. Not only do I agree with it, this is exactly how I want people to think about cases, and so I want to send it to the whole office, and the only question is, do you want your name on it or not? And the guy said, take my name off it, please. I don't want to be this scorned nerd in the lunchroom. But in all seriousness, that's the kind of thing that should get rewarded. And then there needs to be some external accountability. I mean, it's not,
Right.
we can change the culture, but we need to, it's still an adversary system. There's a lot of pressure. Lawyers are competitive people. There's a lot of pressure to win. So we need to mandate that files and discovery are open, that it's not up to prosecutors to decide what evidence you see or don't see, because they're often going to make the wrong judgment, sometimes unintentionally without realizing the significance of what's in the file. And we need to have some external oversight. The bar discipline process has really been a sham. There's actually Ben and Donna had asked me to print out copies for y'all of an op-ed that I wrote in the New York Times earlier this year about the lack of accountability and some recent scandals of prosecutors who've continued to practice law. So that, plus a little packet of info about the Innocence Project, is awaiting you outside if you would like to take it.
One small note on this. It also matters what people in this room do and what you tell your friends to do. When DAs are running for office in the many places they do, you are voters, let's be honest, you're influential voters. And if the only message that ever gets rewarded is, I'm tough on crime, I've locked up this many people, and you don't ask that DA, do you have an integrity unit to make sure that you have the right convictions? Right. Every time somebody is wrongfully convicted, not only do we throw away a real person's life, but there's a guilty person out there who can kill yet another person or harm yet another person. And we need to make sure DAs understand that the political incentives aren't just playing Superman on TV.
Right.
And very few people vote in DA's elections, so your vote really matters because about 5% of eligible voters usually decide those elections.
Let's go back and then we'll come back forward. So we have a couple, I think we have, there we go.
First of all, who dat?
All right.
Little New Orleans.
All right, I know what that means.
I know you know what that means. Number two, have you gotten, since we're speaking of accountability, what has the New Orleans District Attorney's Office, how have they approached you? Have they, to your satisfaction, added accountability to what had happened to you?
I'm gonna let him answer, even though there's litigation pending.
Yeah.
Answer that carefully.
No, they haven't approached me in the sense of morally apologizing or anything. And of course, I haven't received not one dime from no one. Okay, so, and that's another thing. That's really a horrible thing to deal with. I mean, I've been home, 2.5 years now? No apology, no compensation, no anything. Just like you just got to just continue on and keep on fighting. And this, But no, I haven't received anything.
We haven't either. I will say we do have bar complaints pending against the 3 prosecutors who committed the most serious misconduct in Robert's case. One of them is actually the only other person in the state of Louisiana, or I should say the only person to have ever been sanctioned for committing misconduct before. He only got a 3-month suspended sentence from the practice of law the first time around. So one would think that this time there might be more reason to do it. But that process takes a really long time, and it doesn't obviously compensate Robert, which is what the lawsuit is about.
Yes, this has been just amazing, and I think we're all grateful to you for your presentation. But I wondered whether the Innocence Project is focused at all on reforming the defense bar and how robust the defense is of individuals such as Robert, who are caught in the web of our justice system, which clearly is fallible. And I wondered whether you could comment on the quality of the defense you received at the time of the charges were brought against you.
I'm going to actually exercise lawyer's prerogative and not have you talk about the defense lawyer, only because it's an issue in the litigation that's pending. Sorry about that. I'm just being cautious. But I will say that in general, we have seen, like the case I mentioned in West Virginia, some really egregious lawyers literally asleep on the job and figuratively asleep on the job, who encourage clients to take plea bargains to 10 or 20 or 50 years in prison without doing a lick of investigation, telling the clients this is your only chance of avoiding a life sentence, and the clients, young men like Robert, who have no experience with the system, believing them, and it's happened over and over. But I will say that it's a problem often of lack of resources and lack of training and lack of support, in which defense lawyers will have hundreds of cases, literally hundreds at a time, that they are expected to keep track of and juggle. I mean, I can't even remember all those people's names, much less could I possibly do meaningful legal work on their behalf. Right. And we have set up a system that is, it's like an airline system where there's been 358 plane crashes and no one's gone back and looked under the hood. I mean, it's really, and there are some moves, there's some states that have started to really fund indigent defense, but there's a lot of lawsuits about it. And it's an overloaded system, and we will never, and prosecutors are overloaded too, until we really reduce the numbers of cases that are being prosecuted and the stakes in each one, and focus on the most serious of crimes rather than using our court resources to prosecute nonviolent offenses or first-time offenders, or even some of the more quote-unquote violent offenses like a robbery. If you take somebody's backpack off the street, that's a robbery. Does the person deserve to go to jail for 15 years for it? No, in my view, but it's considered a violent crime and a first-degree felony in some places. I mean, that's where it's set up. And so as long as lawyers have clients, hundreds of clients facing that kind of exposure, they're not going to be able to put on adequate defenses.
To be sure, even in a place like New Orleans, and there are other places too, the defense bar in New Orleans actually just about symbolically walked out. They said, we're not taking cases. They were so overwhelmed that they argued to the state Supreme Court that we would be violating our duties as a lawyer to take another case. And so they symbolically quit, so to speak, to bring the entire defense bar to a crisis point. And it tells you how much we as a society have decided to invest. And forgive me for stepping on this, but it bears mentioning that those are the cases that go to trial. America is roughly a 95% plea bargain state. We don't have a system of trials. We actually have a system of plea bargains. And if you're Robert, if you're 16, you're 18, you don't know what's happening, and your lawyer tells you take this plea, just like that, your decades of your life can be gone without any real inspection. So when we say it's the tip of the icebergs of the problem, it really is. Yes, ma'am. And I'll make sure this side of the room gets attention too. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm a New Orleanian, and I wanted to ask you, you know, our police are under a federal consent decree. So what sort of impact does the police is where it all starts, with gathering the evidence and that sort of thing. Is there a connection between the police, the prosecutors, da-da-da-da?
Yes, so the answer is yes. Every case in every jurisdiction is different. I mean, I have personally handled cases where police officers tampered with evidence and literally framed some of my clients. Thankfully, that is not the norm. You know, part of the problem, though, is that the prosecutors, the well-intentioned ones who want to follow the law, rely on the police as the investigators in the field to give them that information. Roberts was not a case where there was a breakdown in communication. It appears it was communicated very vociferously that they had the wrong man and that there was no connection between him and Lester Jones. But in many cases, there are documents in the police file that either the prosecutors don't request or they request and don't get. And so one of the things that we are doing is working to improve those lines of communication. In New York, we recently, last year, after many years of intense behind-the-scenes negotiating, got our chief the High Court in New York, which can change the rules of criminal procedure, to adopt a new order that every prosecutor gets handed at the outset of a case, in every single criminal case, reminding them of what their Brady obligations are, and specifically including in there that the court is directing them to communicate with other law enforcement agencies and ensure that anything that's supposed to be turned over to the defense has been reviewed. And so then the prosecutor has to come in theory, and certify that they've complied with the order. So that gives a prosecutor something to hand to the police and say, look, I'm under an order, I mean, it's the law anyway, but I've got this order from the judge and I'm gonna get in big trouble if you don't let me see your file. So that's one way we think it can help, but also if the prosecutor doesn't do it and lies to the judge and says, I looked at the file, or just violates the order by not doing it, they could in theory be held in contempt of court by that very judge and not have to wait for the longer processes to play out.
Let's take one or two more here. Why don't we start in back, and then you'll be our ultimate.
Yeah, I'm interested in knowing, when you first started this study, you got the education you have, what was your method of studying? How did you go about attacking all that information from a systematic standpoint in the position you were in?
Well, first I started with the law. Then after the law, I studied political science.
Why did you do that?
Because I wanted to understand, not only I wanted to understand the world, I mean the laws that govern my situation, I wanted to understand the world that I lived in, the system as a whole. And upon learning, like I did not study psychology, I studied business, I studied real estate, I studied all those various different things so I can understand the world that I knew that I was going to once live in again. Because I didn't never one time believe I was going to die in prison, you know, in a sense. So I just wanted to be in the world where I understand it. So, and that was like kind of like my order of re-educate myself in that sense.
When guys, I don't mean to ask a second question. I just want to know when guys started to ask you to help them with their cases, what were they asking you to help them with?
Well, they was basically asking me to help them, like, understand the interpretation of the laws, file petitions and things of that nature. And that was basically what my job was as an inmate counsel, was kind of like file petitions for these guys to help these guys do legal research and things of that nature. So, yeah.
One last question, I'm afraid.
Right, yeah. He's been raising his hand.
You've been patient.
Thank you, Robert. You're a shining example of inspiration, and your boxing analogy about fight or flight applies not just to getting out of prison, but for everything in life.
Exactly.
So congratulations for
Thank you.
that. But I do have a brief question for Nina. You've presented an enormous human interest story here. Did Michael Morton ever have a rapprochement with his son?
Yes. It's actually a wonderful story. I mean, it was difficult. You know, his son didn't come to the court hearing. It was too soon. It was too hard. But they met in the backyard of one of our longtime local lawyers in Texas a few months after Michael got out. They're very close now. Michael's son now has three children, so Michael is a grandfather 3 times over, and another one on the way. He married a woman who he met at church who also has 1 grandchild of her own and another one on the way, so they are very busy grandparents. It hasn't been without its bumps, but they are very close, and Michael is so grateful that he got that time back.
I know we're running out of time. Give me just one moment to say, look, so the reason Nina does this, the reason people like Robert are such an inspiration is because our criminal justice systems, sometimes, as Nina's pointed out, is malicious, but it's too often just careless. We don't invest. We don't invest, if we're honest, because they're just a huge group of people who we think their lives just matter less, right? If they get swept up carelessly, so be it. And we oughtn't be shy to point out that this is not randomized. It breaks entirely on class lines. It breaks entirely on racial lines. And that is a stain on all of us. It is something that we in this room can do something about. The last thing I just want to do, I know this sounds a bit trite, but I just want everyone here to just take a moment and think about what you were doing from when you were 20 to when you were 40, right? Just really think about the people you met, think about finishing college, law school, business school, think about your wedding, think about your first child, and then think about those all being gone, just gone, right? These are real lives, real people who also want to meet and marry and raise their children, right? These are not abstractions, and this is the work that the Innocence Project works so tirelessly to recover, to remind people that these are real lives at stake. I hope that you're interested enough to follow up with the flyers outside. I hope that for those of you who can, you get involved or you support the Innocence Project. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that. And I think you can join me in thanking both Nina and Robert for sharing.
Thank you.